Hello everyone, my name is Barbara Barossa. I'm with Putnam County Planning Department. I'd like to welcome all of you for coming. We have some very interesting sessions tonight, and we have staff from Department of State here to run us through everything. We have Aaron Thomas and J.D. Wood to present seeker and local enactment procedures. The first session is seeker. It should run from 3 to 5 o'clock. And we'll have a short break and come back 5:30 for the second half. And that should run until about 7. If anyone needs to use the restroom, it's around the corner. And there's also emergency exits down here if need be. And I'd like to turn it over to Department of State. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. All right, everyone. If you don't mind, I'm going to have a seat tonight. I rolled my ankle on the way in here. It's great to be back here. How many of you were here for the last event that the county put on here for planning and zoning? Nobody? When was it? Barbara, when was the last event? It was December? Nope? Okay, great. How many of you are members of a zoning board of appeals? Okay. How many planning board members do we have here? All right, how many others? All right, would you be town board members perhaps members of code inspector, okay.
Historic District Review Board?
Okay, historic. Okay, so we have a couple representing historic preservation review boards. Great to have you here tonight. So we're gonna start out with seeker, which sometimes can be confounding. So we're going to try to break it down and give you the basics. And I believe we're going to wrap up just about 5 o'clock, and I believe there's a 15-minute break, right, Barbara? Okay, so please feel free to view one of the side TV monitors if this is not showing up all that clear for you. All right, so the seeker regulations come from Environmental Conservation Law, Article 8, Title 6 of the Codes, Rules, and Regulations of the New York, Part 617. And the purpose of these regulations is that state and local agencies must follow the procedures contained within when charged with making a discretionary decision that has been identified by the regulations as an action. Seeker provides an opportunity for communication between local and state agencies, citizens, and project sponsors that may not have otherwise occurred. The process is not a permitting process, or rather one that results in an approval. All right, so there's no way to deny someone by way of a seeker review. Even if you were to give it a positive declaration, meaning that you found one or more adverse environmental impacts, it's still not denial of the project, all right? That just means that further analysis is called for and the seeker process continues. Also, there's no policing agency. Even the DEC, or Department of Environmental Conservation, does not play a role in policing seeker. The only role that they play is in lead agency disputes, which doesn't normally happen. It's kind of a rarity. But you might have the case where two agencies are both vying to be lead agency, or perhaps where nobody wants to be lead agency. In that instance, the DEC will, or rather the commissioner, will make that decision for the jurisdiction. So you might say, what is the enforcing mechanism? And that would be the court system. So it starts with the New York State Supreme Court. It's a 3-tier court system. So what it does is in Article 78, pursuant to the civil practice laws and rules, allows individuals who feel harmed or aggrieved by any decision that perhaps a land use review board has made. It allows them the opportunity to virtually sue the municipality by way of this Article 78 filing, okay? So the same mechanism for enforcement for seeker is true for any other decision you make, be it on site plan review, a certificate of occupancy for the Historic Review Board, or perhaps even a local law that a town board has passed. So the basic purpose of the review is to ensure that the environment is taken into consideration at the earliest time possible. And that's why it's required of any state or local agency, as defined by the seeker regulations, that the seeker process is taken care of before any decisions are made. Okay, so that's before. You can't give approval for a site plan based on seeker working out all right eventually. You need to take care of the seeker process first and get it to the point where it's considered to be, or where that proposed action is considered to be a complete application. And we'll explain that further in the presentation. So the time when seeker is going to be triggered for most of you in this room is going to be at the point that an individual applies for land use approval. So it's the point at which someone perhaps applies for a use variance to the ZBA, or applies for site plan approval to the planning board, or subdivision approval to the planning board. Now, in the case of a local legislative body, a town board, a city council, or a village board of trustees, it's not usual that applications are made to them. They're usually the ones passing laws and generating the actions themselves. Seeker still applies to them. Okay, so when they, for example, pass a local law, the seeker process is required of them as well. JD?
Sure. Question is, what is environmental factors? Seeker interprets environment, the word environment, very broadly. It can mean a whole mess of things, not just the natural environment, but the human environment, the social environment, the economic environment as well. So it's important that we look at seeker. All too many times it was being overlooked pre-60s, 70s. All the water acts, clean air acts came about in the 70s and stuff. And then seeker got developed through that, where they were finding that communities weren't looking at the minute environmental factors such as, and I'll use the example here, the lower right-hand corner, the bog turtle. In New York State, it's endangered, but by the federal status, it's threatened. And more than 75 historic bog turtle locations in New York contain suitable habitat, but only 1/4 of these, however, are known to exist with populations. So that's down to 9 or 10 in the whole state of New York for the bog turtle. So when we're thinking about environment, we're not just thinking about the wetlands, but we're thinking about the playgrounds, the downtown main streets, and the housing as we build out our communities. But it's the entire community, all factors of the community. Do I have control of that? Okay.
Well, you can use the mouse, but
The
I
mouse
got
is
you.
hooked up? Okay, good. All right, so again, seeker, it defines environment broadly and is evidenced by the descriptions that it uses throughout the regulations. And it takes into account for resources and the characteristics that are affected for every action that is being taken in a community. Land, air, water, as you see on the right-hand side, those are pretty much all given that we understand that those are the characteristics that may be affected by some kind of action that your community is taking. Whether it be a new policy, whether it be new programs, whether it be new development, whether it be rezoning your community, or even taking on a comprehensive plan. And we can't forget the plants, the animals, and the different habitats that we're losing faster than we really realize that the endangered animals indigenous to New York State are being threatened by it. The example that I use is I live right up there in Saratoga, and there's this place, Spencer Task has 400 acres that he left. It's a really nice rose gardens and stuff. And I went for my first time, and I said, this is great, but I didn't have a camera. I went back the following year, for this rose garden, and there was only 4 roses in the whole rose garden. What had happened on the other side of Northway, they put in a 50-unit housing development, and all the deer came over to eat the roses. So, you know, it's something that you don't really understand until you see the impacts real up close, you know. Here I am finally with a camera to take a picture of 4 roses. So we have to take that into account. So don't forget the social resources and characteristics, the noise that we're producing by more development, the historic resources that we're losing, the aesthetics, the community identity that you want to hold on to, if that's one of the things that you're pulling in for tourism and stuff, and it's starting to look like honky-tonk, well then you're losing that, the aesthetics as well. And then looking at your population patterns as they're growing up or down, or where the sprawl is going, or if we have so much housing, or a lot of abandoned buildings and blight because the companies that have supported the economics there or the jobs have moved on. All those factors take into effect. And then the question that I pose is, does a building of a category killer like a big box store, does that not, that wipes out all your basic retail on downtown Main Street, does that not also affect and impact your community and your environment as well? Sure it does. Next one, please. So, to you, sorry, that was quick.
Okay, so how does seeker work? We have 2 slides here. One is in text and one kind of provides you a roadmap, and that's the chart that the Department of Environmental Conservation rolled out with their revised environmental assessment forms a couple of years ago. So I'm going to stay on this picture here while I go over the text statements in the other slide. Okay, so the first step is that an agency either proposes an application, such as a town board introducing a local law and wishing to adopt it, or an agency receives an application, such as a planning board receiving one for subdivision approval. Then the next step, or rather that's what triggers seeker, the next step is to classify the action. So we see that up top here. And we see that there are 3 options here. We've got type 1, unlisted, and type 2. Notice here with type 2, at classification, seeker is completed. So we follow this arrow right down here to the end of the process. And we're going to talk about those actions that qualify as being a type 2 action, which are virtually exempt from the seeker process. Now, if something doesn't fall under this list of type 2 actions, it's going to be categorized as either type 1 or unlisted. Type 1 carries the presumption of the possibility or potential for having an adverse environmental impact, or more than one adverse environmental impact. So we see here that there's a less flexibility in the review process than is true for the type action. For unlisted actions, they fall kind of right in between these 2 lists. We've got a type 1 list, type 1 list and a type 2 list. These unlisted actions are unlisted, aptly named, and we see here some flexibility. Whereas in type 1, in the case of a type 1 action, a full environmental assessment form is required. For an unlisted action, a short form may be required. So whether it's short or full is at the option of the lead agency if it's a coordinated review, or if it's uncoordinated, it would be at the option of the involved agencies doing their own separate reviews. So I mentioned coordinated and uncoordinated. For unlisted actions, both of these 2 methods are a possibility or an option. For a type 1 action, we see only coordinated review is a possibility, all right? So there's definitely more flexibility for the unlisted action, and that flexibility is not necessarily weigh in favor of the applicant. It's the board's decision. Okay, so the board can decide how much information they'd like to receive by way of a short form or full form, and whether or not they'd like to utilize a coordinated or uncoordinated review process. Now, either way, we come down here to the next step after that EAF has been analyzed, or environmental assessment form has been analyzed, and we review all of the criteria and decide whether or not there are going to be any potential adverse environmental actions. If the board or boards decide no, then a negative declaration is made. So the negative declaration is the determination of significance, and we see that the process ends. If one or more adverse environmental impacts have been identified, the determination of significance is going to be positive, a positive declaration, and then we move on to a whole nother set of processes that we'll talk about later in the presentation. Okay, JD?
Okay, with actions basically are what you're deciding on, or where you're going from here. It's a discretionary decision that is being made to fund or approve or directly undertake a project in the community. Physical activities may affect the environment in some way, or adopting new policies or new laws, or for your local laws, ordinances, or any of your resolutions. Those are all actions. Next slide, please. So what are actions? Undertaking, as I said, the funding and approving the projects of physical activities. Actions may include direct actions where government agency sponsors such a movement towards physical construction, planning and policy making, adopting new rules, regulations, new procedures, also granting an approval of funding. And actions are discretionary decisions that are being made and have one or more impacts on the environment in the long run. So discretionary essentially implies that the ability for the agency to be able to make the decision of yes, no, or only if so-and-so by adding conditions. A policy, like planning policy activities in the second bullet down, a policy may be two-dimensional, but once it is applied to an actual physical matter, it does matter, because now it's a three-dimensional change in the substance and form and may involve impacts that weren't realized when you were making that policy. Next slide, please. As Erin nicely pointed out with her chart, the three actions. The actions that you have to give one of these classifications for these actions, in order to determine the level of the review that is required for any of the actions, you have to come to some kind of determination of which classification, as Erin pointed out. And until then, you won't know which forms you're going to need to use or how in-depth you need to determine the level of the impacts, or search at how much the impacts are going to affect the community. The initial review, depending on the classification of type 1, type 2, and unlisted, is all that makes the big difference here once the actions are made.
Okay, so now we're going to do a little exercise, and I'm going to ask everybody to start at the back of their packets. Has everyone picked up a copy of the presentation on the way in? Have it, please go to the back. And I want you to count back 7 pages, or rather 6 pages, because we're starting with type 2 actions. What you'll find in there are excerpts from the seeker regulations. You're going to find the type 1 and type 2 list. So we're starting with type 2. We're going to kind of back it in, smallest to largest. I believe it will say page 2 on the bottom, and it's the physical page, the physical 6th page from the back. Anybody not there? Okay. All right, so this is where the list starts, and it gives you a little bit of a description as to what type 2 actions are, but I want you to follow down to subsection C. Rather, that's where the list starts. There's a couple introductory paragraphs there. So if you go to subsection C, it says, the following actions are not subject to review. All right? and you're gonna see 37 actions. So these are specifically those that upon drafting and adoption of the seeker regulations, the DEC and the legislature have decided are those that should be exempt from seeker because they have been predetermined not to have any significant adverse impact on the environment, okay? So let's go through a couple examples. Number 3 on that list speaks to farm operations. It says agricultural farm management practices, including construction, maintenance, and repair of farm buildings and structures, and land use changes consistent with generally accepted principles of farming. If we go to number 10 on the list, construction, expansion, or placement of minor accessory residential structures, including garages, carports, patios, decks, swimming pools, tennis courts, satellite dishes, fences, barns, storage sheds, or other buildings not changing land use or density. Number 12 on that list, granting of individual setback and lot line variances. Number 13, granting of an area variance for a single family, 2-family, or 3-family residence. So this is why zoning board of appeals members rarely are required to incorporate a seeker review into their general approval process, okay? Because many of the actions for which the applications would include that come to them fall under this type 2 list. Now, mind you, we'll talk about it in a minute, use variances are not on this list. So you might be saying to yourself, yeah, every once in a while, you know, we get an application for a use variance and nope, we did not do seeker. So think about that. It happens all the time, but we just want to make sure that you correct that from this point forward. All right, so as I mentioned earlier when we were looking at that roadmap or that chart that DEC put together, at classification, seeker is done for type 2 actions, okay? So now we are going to talk about type 1 action. So go back, it might be 2 pages now, 1 or 2 pages now, and go back to that type 1 list. So that's section 617.4. And if we follow down here to subsection B, it's going to be about halfway down the page, and then we look at the first action on this list, or the first subset on the list. It says the adoption of a municipality's land use plan, the adoption by any agency of a comprehensive resource management plan, or the initial adoption of a municipality's comprehensive zoning regulations. So this would include comprehensive plans as being a type 1 action. Number 2 on the list, the adoption of changes in the allowable uses within any zoning district affecting 25 or more acres of the district. So this would include some zoning revisions. Okay, so some municipality-wide zoning revisions might fall under this. So they might be type 1 actions, or they may not if we are affecting less than 25 acres. That's the threshold that's set here. Number 3, the granting of a zoning change at the request of an applicant for an action that meets or exceeds one or more of the thresholds given elsewhere on this list. Okay, that's complicated. That's when we start needing to use formulas for these actions, and that does happen in a few areas here. So an example would be a request for a legislative zone change. So that's not a use variance that a ZBA would approve. This would be an application from a property owner to, say, a town board to rezone their property. All right, so that's, like I say, an application for a use variance would be, I want to utilize my property for a restaurant. That doesn't rezone their property now as commercial. just means they can operate a restaurant there. So this would be going to your town board and rezoning that entire parcel for commercial, which could include restaurants, could include a number of other things perhaps. If this happens and granting of a zoning change at the request, okay, for an action that meets or exceeds one or more of the thresholds given elsewhere on this list. So if there's another action, or excuse me, if there's another item on this list here that is met or exceeded, it will bump that request for a legislative zone change to a type 1 action. Now, if you continue down the list to number 5, that speaks to construction of new residential units. And we'll see some more thresholds here. We'll see 10 units in municipalities that have not adopted zoning or subdivision regulations. So we'll see that there's a number of different thresholds depending on whether or not the community has adopted zoning or subdivision regulations, how many units are being proposed, whether or not the community has municipal infrastructure already in place, such as sewer and water, the population of that municipality, and things of that nature. So when you receive an application for residential plans, go to this list and check out all these thresholds, and you might have to do some math, there might be some formulas involved, to make sure that you are correctly classifying the action. If you go down to item number 6, this speaks to commercial development. So this is going to include non-residential development. And you'll see some of those thresholds or some of those criteria are used here to create the thresholds also, but we have a couple different ones in here, such as subsection 3, parking for 1,000 vehicles. All right, so we don't deal with parking in the residential part. So this is where, and you might need a little help with this, and you might all kind of need to come together and form a consensus that you're properly classifying an action, because there may be some disagreement amongst board members or even your zoning officer, code enforcement officer that gave you the application and said, hey, this is a type 1 or this is an unlisted action. So this is why I'm going through this really painful exercise with you right now, to kind of empower you to kind of take a look for yourself and make sure you're doing it right. Okay, so back to the slide. All these actions here included on this list are those that carry the presumption that there will be at least one significant adverse environmental impacts. And simply by classification, the likelihood that a positive declaration is going to be much greater, meaning that you will find one or more of these impacts. And when a positive declaration is issued, what's required is drafting of an EIS, or environmental impact statement. So that kind of slides us off on a whole nother path, and we'll talk about that all the way at the end of the presentation. So the unlisted actions, again aptly named, are those that don't fall under any of these lists. So you're not going to find them in the regulations. They're just going to be those that exceed the thresholds listed for type 2 actions and fall under those thresholds that are listed for type 1 actions. So they're going to be right in the middle. And we've listed a couple examples here, and these only come from simply by using those formulas to kind of get in between those two thresholds. So a use variance needing no other approvals, all right? Use variance is not listed on the type 2 list. It's not listed on the type 1 list either. Now, maybe if there's some other, let's say it's a site plan, in addition to requiring a use variance, it's an application for a site plan review, all right? Perhaps the amount of development, be it the number of units being proposed or the amount of parking being proposed, number of parking spaces being proposed, some other aspect of that proposal might bump it up to being a type 1 action. But if not, it could simply be unlisted. So, to make it even more complicated, localities are afforded the opportunity to adapt their own Type 1 and Type 2 list. So if you come across an application regularly for a particular action and you kind of disagree with how it's classified, maybe you feel like a more stringent review should be done, or you feel like, it's an unlisted action, and you know, why are we going through the motions every time we get this type of application? Why do we have to deal with seeker for this? It's really not necessary. Our own review process kind of handles this anyway. Your town board or city council or village board of trustees can adopt supplemental Type 1 or Type 2 lists. However, if the action requires approval from an agency outside of your jurisdiction, so it's a subdivision application, and it requires some sort of approval from, let's say, a state agency. That state agency is not bound by your new classification. So this only works if it's a proposal that's going to stay within your own review boards in your own jurisdiction. So let's say the town board needs to make a legislative zoning change. The site plan review is required by the planning board, and area variances are required by the zoning board of appeals. So you have 3 different local boards working on this proposal. Your local supplemental Type 1 or Type 2 list would apply. But as soon as you get an outside agency involved, then all of a sudden you have to revert to the seeker regulations. Okay, JD?
Well, the last point on that slide too, is once you start the seeker process, you continue right on through until it's finished.
Right, with both Type 1 and unlisted actions, which is different from Type 2, you must continue on with the seeker process.
Okay, Erin's explained pretty much what needs to be reviewed, and now we're going to talk about who reviews. Those bodies who have a stake in the actions that are being taken are all considered the agencies.
I'm going like waiting for you to use the arrow.
Do it.
You gotta click off that box, you gotta click the space. Oh, off the box, click off the box.
Do it here. Aha, here we go. Okay, under seeker, the agencies that can be considered one of 3 roles are the lead agency, the involved agencies, and the interested agencies. Lead agencies are pretty much a subset of the groups that are involved agencies, and they can only come from there. The lead agency can only come from the involved agencies. Okay, it can't come from an agency of interest. Agency is a state or local body or a public body. Involved agency is a public body which has jurisdiction by law to fund or approve the project or directly undertake an action, whereas an involved interested agency is a public body which does not have the jurisdiction over the project but wishes to participate in the process and use their expertise in their special concerns. So the lead agency is pretty much the involved agency responsible for determining whether the EIS or the environmental impact statement will be required, and for the preparation and the filing of the required materials of going through the seeker process. Here's the breakdown of pretty much the agencies from New York codes, rules, regulations, and environmental law into involved and interested. On the left-hand side, you see an involved. It might be the planning board, zoning board, town board, village board, school board, industrial development, and so forth, and state agencies, where others that might be interested might be environmental management, the historic preservation board, county board of regional, for the 239M review, so the county would be involved and be interested, but they don't have any say on being involved or being a lead agency in this Not classified as a secret agency would be like the federal departments or agencies such as FERCA, the Federal Energy Regulation Commission, or the Army Corps of Engineers. They wouldn't be classified as secret agencies. All right, establishing a lead agency. If there's only one agency that's involved, that is pretty much who becomes the lead agency. And just by design, you're all by yourself. But if there are more than one, the lead agency is selected by consensus amongst the other agencies. And had Aaron mentioned in an earlier slide, the only time that the DEC really gets involved is if there's a conflict. If there is no agency that's willing to take on the lead agency, or if there are two or more agencies that want the sole responsibility for being the lead agency, then the DEC would be contacted and they would settle that dispute and appoint one. So if a lead agency cannot be agreed upon within 30 calendar days, any of the involved agencies ask the DEC and the commissioner to resolve the dispute by designating the lead agency. Once all the involved agencies have been identified, the leader or the lead agency must be delegated and then take that role to be the lead agency. In the case of uncoordinated review, a lead agency is not necessary will be acting independently. Everyone is going to be, all the agencies are going to be uncoordinated. They're all going to be doing their own thing, and review and declare determination of significance all comes down later without having a lead agency because it's not coordinated. Establishing the lead agency, we got to watch the calendar days for timelines. The proposed action and the first received the application. All the involved agencies are contacted, and that gives them time to speak up and say, I'd like to be the lead, or we're going to be part of this. And you distribute the EAF Part 1 of the application to all the agencies that may become the lead agency. So once the lead agency is established within those 30 days, then they make the determination of significance, but you have to do that within 20 days. And I mentioned GML 239M earlier. That's the review that need not be concluded prior with the county, the county receives the full statement of Part 1 of the material, of all the materials submitted in the seeker application.
Okay, do we have any questions at this time? Sure.
Could you please address what appears to be discrepancy between the type 1 list, number 9, and the type 2 list, number 19?
One list. The question is, what is the discrepancy between the type 1 list number 9 first? You're getting into the tough ones. And which item on the type 2 list?
19.
19. Okay, so let's start with the type 2. That's easier. Okay, number 19 says, official acts of a ministerial nature involving no exercise of discretion. I remember planning boards and zoning board of appeals members usually use discretion in making their decisions, okay? Including building permits and historic preservation permits where issuance is predicated solely on the applicant's compliance or non-compliance with the relevant local building or preservation code. Okay, so this applies to building permits that are issued by building code officers, not necessarily zoning enforcement officers. So these are building permits issued pursuant to the New York State Fire Prevention and Building Code. And some communities where a local historic preservation district has been adopted, and they have a historic preservation review board, such as your community. Usually these boards simply review improvements to the exterior of buildings, right? You're not looking at the interior buildings, it's exterior improvements of those buildings contained within the geographical boundary outlined by that historic preservation district. Some communities have adopted a set approved color palette, for example. Okay, so they might come in with paint samples and they might have approved this. These are the colors that are acceptable if somebody would like to repaint their building. In that case, if someone were to come in and say, hey, you know, they come in for their building permit, if they know they're supposed to do that in a historic preservation district, and they say, hey, I want to paint my building, the building code officer could present them with this pre-approved color palette and say, okay, just stay within these colors, and then you don't have to go to the historic preservation board. Okay, these are pre-approved. So that would be a ministerial action. There was no subjectivity involved, no discretion, all right? So that is a type 2 action. Now, your other question is much more complicated, and let's make sure that I phrase this correctly here. Okay, so number 9 on the type 1 list says, and it applies to actions to a historic building or to a building in a historic district. It says, any unlisted action, unless the action is designed for the preservation of the facility or site, occurring wholly or partially within or substantially contiguous to any historic building, structure, facility, site, or district, or prehistoric site that is listed on the National Register of Historic Places or that has been proposed by the New York State Board of Historic Preservation for a recommendation to the State Historic Preservation Officer for a nomination for inclusion on the National Register. So that's those buildings or sites on the register or those that have been nominated for the register. Okay, so it gets so wordy there. So any unlisted action occurring wholly or partially within or next to such a structure or site. So what it means is any action that would normally be an unlisted action, so let's say site plan review. It doesn't fall to, it doesn't rise to any of the criteria or thresholds otherwise on this list here for this site plan review proposal, except for the fact that it's in a historic district. So it's any unlisted action, any otherwise unlisted action, but it happens to be next to or on a historic site, that bumps it up to a type 1 threshold. And there's some even more confounding formulas here. I didn't want to go into this, such as number 8 on the list speaks to any otherwise unlisted action. Let's go back to, that's not really going to work here. So any otherwise unlisted action that includes a non-agricultural use, so let's say a commercial use, occurring wholly or partially within an agricultural district, and exceeds 25% of any threshold established in this section. So it's a non-agricultural use in a state-designated agricultural district. That doesn't necessarily mean local, that's different. And so it's otherwise an unlisted action, but looking at the thresholds on the type 1 list for all the other actions, if it exceeds, it meets or exceeds 25% of any of those other actions, then it gets bumped up to type 1. So, okay, let's go back to site plan review. For a building in a state designated a state designated agricultural district. So they want to do some sort of commercial activity here. It's otherwise unlisted, but they want 250 parking spots. So if we go back to number 6, under the commercial activities here, and go down to subset 3, subset, triple I, it says parking for 1,000 vehicles. 25% of 1,000 vehicles is 250. So 250 parking spots. If that person in that ag district that is proposing an unlisted action, but they want 251 parking spaces, then it would bump it up to a type 1 threshold. I feel I'm losing people. It really the final items on this list really get confusing. Yeah.
The reason that I asked that question, and I was trying to get you to tease that out a bit, is that we have heard a couple of different interpretations of number 9. One that says actions in a district on the national register are automatically type 1s, and they are not necessarily type 1s because of this paragraph. And I was trying to see where you would go with that.
Right. Currently, under the current regulations, that's not the case.
Okay.
They do have some proposed changes to the regulations that have been sitting out here for almost 2 years now. And I'm trying to remember, I think they wanted to alter that one? I'll have to get back to you. I think they want to alter number 9 to fall in line with the crazy formulas I just described in number 8, and the same thing happens on item number 10, parkland and open space. So I think they want to go that route. So you can talk to me afterwards and I'll pull up the changes and we can kind of figure that out. But this is why I suggest talking to people who are knowledgeable about it. Certainly you can call our office if we can't give you an official opinion, we can't tell you what to do, but we could give you our opinion, but you do what you will with that. All right. Okay. Any other questions?
May I follow up on that, please?
Okay.
Is it correct, I'm reading this correctly, numbers 8 through 11 in type 1 all refer to unlisted actions.
Right, so they're otherwise unlisted action, but something else is happening to bump them up to a type 1. So
Well, an unlisted action, but if that action, if the action is not an unlisted action, but it's already a type 2 action, that does not apply.
if something's type 2, it's type 2.
That's right.
Right. Yep, if it's type 2, it's type 2. But if it's unlisted, if it's falling in between the two, and something else is happening here, so, like I said, number 8 speaks to ag properties, number 9 speaks to historic, number 10 speaks to parkland. If any other thing is happening here, but not necessarily but only 25% of another item for both actions 8 and 10, and then historic, number 9 on historic is a little different. So if you need further clarification, please talk to me afterwards. It really does get complicated. I think we had one other question back here.
If a CAC or something like that wants to give input on an application and be an interested party, whose decision is it? The town board, the planning board, or can they just do it by law?
CAC?
Conservation Advisory Committee,
Committee.
Or something else, a stormwater committee or...
Unless, the only way that they can be an involved agency,
Not as an involved agency.
as an interested agency, They don't have any more rights or powers than a regular citizen not appointed to a review board. Yeah, they can certainly, it's great for them to give their recommendations and opinions. It is, because they have expertise in a certain area of the project that presumably the involved agencies don't have, so I highly recommend that they do that, but they don't technically have any higher authority than Joe off the street.
Okay, thank you.
Is that it? Okay.
And one other thing, why is it always seems confusing that a negative declaration is a positive action and a positive declaration is a negative action?
I would challenge you not
Well,
to
a
see it
positive
that way.
Well, a positive declaration says that you're not finished yet, you have to come back and give us more information. A negative declaration says you're good, so, it seems confusing.
Positive says you saw something of impact, negative says you didn't see anything of impact.
Well, right,
So
exactly.
leave it at that.
From a planning board's point of view, a negative declaration says this is good, goodbye.
I wasn't born when they wrote the regulations, so I'm not sure.
We were blaming you.
Okay, so now we've talked about what's subject to seeker, and we've talked about who the players are. Now we're going to get into the actual review. So I know that it's a lot of background discussion and material just to even get to the review part. That's why people request this course so often. All right, so here we are at the yield sign, meaning no decisions can be made before seeker is concluded. Okay, so no agencies that have any sort of approval function can approve or deny any action before seeker is completed. Okay, so what is a complete application? This is another really confusing thing about seeker. Really gonna blow your minds tonight. Okay, so a lot of people will say, all right, so somebody came in and they turned in their site plan application a week ago. They gave it to the secretary, so that means we gotta hurry up, and we only have 62 days to schedule our public hearing, so we gotta hurry up and make sure we schedule that, right? The answer is no, not if seeker is involved. The seeker regulations specifically refer to this concept of complete application. Now, if you go to the enabling statutes, town law, city, general city law, and village law, and you go to each section pertaining to the different types of land approvals, so if you go to the site plan section, the special use permit section, and the subdivision section, and variance section, it all kind of has there's different variations of this there. Sometimes you'll see application received. Sometimes it will say that. It's still referring to complete application. If you see application complete and received, or received and complete, something like that, it's all referring to this concept, which means that an applicant has sufficiently filled out your local application form, the EAF, they've included all of the background material that you require locally, such as topographic maps and stormwater plan and the plat designed by a state licensed surveyor, all these things. So the application has been satisfactorily completed to your liking, to your local regulations, and either a negative declaration has been issued or a positive declaration has been issued, and you've gotten as far into the process as that draft environmental impact statement being completed and ready for public consumption. So these are the two specific points in the process where the application is complete. And this is what sets off the the requirement, the statutory requirements for for you to hold your public hearings within 62 calendar days. So a lot of communities will front load their public hearings improperly, and a lot of times to their detriment, because it gives them less time to review the information, okay? So technically, you do not need to schedule your public hearing until the application is complete. And then you have 62 days from that time to do it. So you have this whole 62-day period from the time in which you've reached one of these 2 points. So a lot of communities will be nice to their applicants, and they might issue a negative declaration and do the public hearing in the same meeting. That's okay, but consider this. What if you didn't issue the negative declaration? You issued, it turns out that after deliberation at your meeting that night, you did, you did discover that there was at least one significant adverse environmental action, and you had to give it a positive declaration. Well, you can't go on with your hearing just then, because the hearing is meant to be scheduled after the positive declaration, after that draft EIS has been completed and is ready for public review. Sorry, guys. How's everybody holding up? I wish we had some cookies, Barbara. I'm gonna bring cookies the next time I do this. Okay,
You didn't bring cookies?
I didn't bring cookies. There is a vending machine though. I think I'm gonna go out there on the break and just start pulling them out for you guys.
Aaron, I did bring cookies for the break.
There's cookies for the break, thank God. Okay, so this is just the point of this is just to alert you to the fact that you have more time to review the information, all right? The statutory clock doesn't start running until you've reached this point. Okay, so over the past 4 decades or so, the state courts have deliberated on seeker cases as the enforcement mechanism. And they've determined through case law that both literal and substantive compliance is required. So literal compliance speaks to the literal requirements within the seeker regulation. So that's dotting your I's and crossing your T's, following and complying with all of the timeframes set forth, completing filing requirements, publishing with the environmental notice bulletin if required, all of that kind of stuff. It also requires that, it also specifies that some elements of your local planning and zoning review may be similar to seeker review, but they aren't to be substituted for or represented as being equivalent to seeker's requirements. So for example, on a use variance application, under the statute, the 3rd prong of the use variance test is that the proposed action will not alter the essential neighborhood of the character, okay? Well, you might, thinking back to what JD was talking about earlier in terms of environmental factors, neighborhood character is certainly considered an environmental resource or characteristic under the seeker regulations. So just because you are going to eventually consider neighborhood character while reviewing the application pursuant to the 4-prong use variance test doesn't mean you skip over that part during the seeker review, okay? They are separate and distinct processes, okay? So there might be some overlap. Traffic impacts, all right? Traffic is an environmental consideration. Well, you might have that listed under site plan review also, all right? So you might be looking at kind of the same information twice, perhaps you'll come to a different conclusion the second time around, perhaps not, perhaps, and probably more importantly, through the seeker process, you will improve traffic impact through this process, through negotiating with the applicant, so that when you look at traffic a second time during the site plan review phase, that it's been improved to your satisfaction, and you don't have to worry about it then. Now, within the enabling statutes, again going back to town law, village law, and general city law, seeker has been directly incorporated within there. So we always recommend that you take a look at these, and one of the publications that our agency puts out is called Guide to Planning and Zoning Laws of New York State. So excerpts from each of these 3 statutes that specifically regards to planning and zoning board functions have been compiled all together and put under a nice easy table of contents, so you can find out what the state law says about things. All right, so you can go there and sometimes maybe compare it with your local law. You know, your local laws perhaps might not be in compliance with state laws, or perhaps you are afforded the opportunity to enhance your review criteria or processes, and you didn't even know it. So anyway, the subdivision sections within these enabling statutes is really long compared to site plan and variances and special use permits, and that's because they've incorporated the seeker process in there. And while it's kind of daunting to take a look at, it's good that they've done that, because it can be very confusing to figure out how to incorporate seeker into subdivision. And they've even gone as far as to outline or delineate how to handle seeker if you have a preliminary, if you're in a community that has both preliminary and final site plan, preliminary and final subdivision approval, or just final subdivision approval. So some communities have a 1-step review process with just final. Some have a 2, they use preliminary and final. Some use a 3. They use that informal sketch planning phase in addition to preliminary and final. So it separates out how to handle those 2, and it also further separates out whether or not the planning board acts as lead agency, which I generally recommend for subdivision that the planning board does. They generally have the most jurisdiction over this action. But in the case that they don't, it delineates how to deal with it in that case, and also whether or not a positive declaration or negative declaration is issued. Okay, so here is that substantive compliance that I alluded to a couple slides ago. And this refers to review boards actually doing their due diligence during the seeker process to actually look at all of the possible environmental impacts. As JD said, include those human impacts, include parking and traffic and noise and negative impacts to historic or cultural resources or view sheds. All of that gets included here, and what's asked of you is that you don't just rubber stamp projects. You don't just get seeker out of the way, okay? So this phrase, taking a hard look, comes from a case a few decades ago in Syracuse in regard to the Carrier Dome. The review board did not take a hard look. They rubber stamped seeker. They disregarded the traffic impacts, and they had to come back and reopen seeker again. What's also required of you is that you record written reasons as to why you've issued a positive or negative declaration. Okay, include this within your file. Has anyone heard of segmentation? Yes. Okay, all right, we got at least one hand. Okay, so segmentation generally refers to piecemealing a review process, so that, for example, so that perhaps what would ordinarily be a type 1 action might come in as being an unlisted action, but the applicant maybe knows they're coming down the pike with some more stuff that they're going to add on. So they're segmenting or dividing the review. And this can happen, and that's just one example in as to how it can happen. Now there are ways to work this out, because a lot of developers these days like to develop in phases. They don't have all the money up front to come in and complete the entire development all in one time. They want to come in, they want to build a few condos, they want to sell those condos, then they want to come in and get approval for the second phase. Then they want to build those condos, then they want to use the money for that for the next phase, right? Or they might have phase 2 in queue while they're coming in for 3. So this is, you know, kind of general development practice. So there's kind of 2 ways that you could perhaps deal with this. The method that the DEC recommends is that you require an environmental impact statement, and that environmental impact statement takes into account the full build out of the parcel or parcels in the future. All right, so they might only be looking to develop a quarter of the larger parcel, but they know, you know, down the pike that they're going to come in for the rest, and you say, okay, well, at current zoning, under current allowable densities, we're going to issue a positive declaration, which again doesn't mean disapproval, but we are going to analyze the full, at max build out under our current zoning, at full density, what the impacts could be on our community. All right, and we're going to analyze them. That's not denying the project, and we're going to hold on to this information when you come in for your subsequent phases. Okay, and we might ask you to make some improvements, maybe sooner than later, maybe some infrastructure improvements sooner than later to account for this projected development. Another way to handle this, which is probably easier, well, it's definitely easier, is that you inform the developer that any subsequent phases that come forth, when you review those, you are going to take into account the cumulative impact of all of the development prior. Okay, so you're not just looking at it piece by piece. They come in for phase 2 and they say, okay, well, we're gonna, you know, we're not rescinding, you know, approvals for phase 1, but let's look at the cumulative traffic impact for these 2. Let's talk about how you need to maybe make some infrastructure improvements. Like, we're not going to be able to pump water. We don't have the capacity to pump water to your development from the main road. You're going to need to improve that, okay? All right, let's see here. I'm gonna wrap up there. Okay.
All right, my turn. You finally get a breather. Okay, the new forms have only been in effect for almost 2 years now, but both the short and the full forms, assessment forms, are provided to collect information and data to evaluate the potential impacts that there might be for the environmental impacts during the review process. They are not applications. Don't make that mistake in considering them as an application. But the information that's contained in the EAFs are helpful to classify those actions. And as Aaron said, possibly you could even use the short form for class 2, type 2 classifications, just so there's not any misunderstanding further down the road. But the EAFs are, the full form is required for type 1 actions, and it may also be required for an unlisted action, whereas a lot of times just the short form is used for the unlisted. So the short form has been expanded from 2 pages to 4 pages. Not that it matters to you, but and the previous one for the full was 21, now it's 25, but they're a lot easier to use supposedly, and looking over, along with the workbooks and then the interactive, the mapping, seems to have improved the whole seeker process. But with the improvements, there's things that have been included that weren't included before the last time they were revised, that things such as questions pertaining to multimodal forms of transportation, such as cycling and pedestrian paths and accessibility, those all have been added, whereas in the past they all were overlooked. So they're included now. So the full form continues to be larger than, of course, the short form. But both the full and the short forms, the applicant does the first part, and that's the project sponsor, and they have to fill that all out. And both forms are laid out in 3 parts, and the first part, of course, by the applicant itself. Now, the second part, the impacts and their magnitude, is done by the lead agency, as well as the third part. And the lead agency is responsible for the completion of the third part, in part is meant to evaluate the moderate to large impacts that are identified in parts 2 and 3, that a reviewing agency evaluates whether or not the potential impacts are significant or not. And then you go from there. The context is the probability of occurrence, and the duration of the occurrence, and the impacts, and the irreversibility of the impacts to the geographic area, the scope, the magnitude, and the cumulative impacts that Aaron was just talking about. They all need to be considered. So for the update, the forms were just done in October 13, and you can see how they needed to be updated. In 78, we weren't talking about cycle paths and pedestrians, whereas now the new buzzword is walkable communities, that we're trying to lessen our impacts and cut down on sprawl to have more walkable communities. But these are the kind of things that weren't even considered in 78, and then of course the short form was last revised in 87. So both of them bring up to date now. The change, one big change, is no longer is a visual assessment form as a separate thing. It's included in a statement of in the significance itself in part 3. And then the online workbooks, as I said, are detailed, and they pretty much are good guidance step by step. If you use them, have you used the workbooks? They're online, downloadable, whatever, and they help you go and skip. And the mapper itself is interactive, where it helps you fill in information. So things that you may not even know about, by just putting in the coordinates of a property that you're looking at, it might auto-fill where the wetlands are and different significant things, where it's a step saver. Okay.
Before you go ahead, may I ask a question? Could you say what you said again regarding type 2 and short EAF?
Yeah, you can still do the short form for a type 2, just to make sure that it shows that you did look for the impacts, and you're making that statement, no significance, even though it's concluded without an EAF.
Thanks.
And just to clarify there, and that is true, but just to clarify, an applicant doesn't have to do an EIF for a type 2 because seekers concluded a classification, but it helps to have the EIF, to have that information available to make your classification. So when I was a municipal planner, I used to include a short form attached to all of my local land use applications, and I'd have everybody fill that out, because sometimes I'd uncover some additional information that would perhaps raise what I would have ordinarily thought was a type 2 action to an unlisted.
Thanks.
Another question?
Okay, sorry. Okay, so as we talked about earlier in the presentation, and I'm gonna just back it up here. I'm gonna get back to that map in the beginning. All right, so here we are. We've classified the action. We've talked about the difference between the short form and the full form, and when it can be used, and when the short form can't be used. Now we're going to talk about coordinated review and uncoordinated review. All right, and again, you see here that it's coordinated review is an option here where it's not here. So uncoordinated review, again, is only an option for unlisted actions, and there is no lead agency. Sorry. There's no lead agency for coordinated review because you're not coordinating. This means each agency is independently conducting their own seeker analysis or evaluation, all right? I don't recommend this method personally because of the final bullet here. It involves some risk of repetition or overlap in the review. Because if any one of those involved agencies during the course of their review finds an environmental impact and issues a positive declaration, that means everybody has to come back to the table and start over again with a coordinated review. To me, that sounds really redundant and confusing to the applicant. I'd be pretty mad if that happened to me. So I generally suggest using the coordinated review even for unlisted actions, but it's up to you to determine how you want to proceed with that. Now there's a caveat here. So let's see, so all involved agencies must coordinate if one of those agencies issues a positive declaration. So in other words, any negative declaration is superseded by a positive declaration. So the caveat is that if one or all of those agencies that issued a negative declaration went ahead and issued their final approval before they knew about the positive declaration, they don't have to come back to the table. Okay? So if they issued the negative declaration and they said, okay, so we're gonna have our public hearing at the next meeting, we're gonna have it a month from now. If they do hear about the positive declaration from another agency, that means they have to start over again. Okay, so there's like a caveat on the caveat on the caveat. That's how this kind of goes. That's why there's a lot of lawyers that specifically practice seeker law, and they do pretty well. All right, so coordinated review is the other option, the one I suggest even for those unlisted actions. But this is where where one of the involved agencies comes together for one integrated environmental review. So one agency, one involved agency, the lead, takes the lead and conducts the review. And those other involved and interested agencies can certainly assist by providing comment and opinions and recommendations, but it's really at the hands of the lead agency to make decisions at that point. Now this bullet here cannot be delegated. That refers to things like subcommittees. So on a town board or city council, there might be a safety committee or a finance committee. Sometimes town board members will have smaller committees to deal with kind of their own issue area. They'll be the ones that will bring forth the local law. Let's say they're on the safety committee and they might propose a junk law or one involving police officers or something like that. It can't be delegated to one of those. That review has to stay with the town board if the town board is lead agency. JD?
Okay. So you have all the materials in front of you. It's time to make a determination of significance. This is a critical step here to be able to do that, because from everything, all the review is determined from the significance on from here. It's that corner blue in the middle of the picture there. You hear that a lot about that for the Pine Bush area, and above that is my commute every morning to Albany. So you take in all these factors into the significance of making the determination, using a criteria that I'm taking right from 617.7C, criteria for determining significance, and this is right from the seeker. Says the impacts that may be reasonably expected to result from the proposed action must be compared against the criteria in this subdivision. The following list is illustrated, not exhaustive. The criteria are considered indicators of significant adverse impacts on the environment, and they're listed here on the slide. So the changes in the environment and the reduce of the wildlife, as we pretty much have been talking about, the different conflicts, but creating conflict with the community plan, your comprehensive plan, or the community character itself. So those things are all part of the criteria that we're looking at. To evaluate the impacts, it's broken down into magnitude, duration, and likelihood. So it addresses the moderate to large impacts this way. And we understand what makes the impact significant, so we have to look at the magnitude. How big, how large, how severe, the likelihood of it happening, the impact with the context of the geographic scope of the whole project, the setting, the scale of the project, and the project area. The evaluation of the magnitude and the importance of the impacts, the key characteristics of the possible impacts. The magnitude assesses the factors such as the severity of the size and the extent of the impacts, moderate to large. The duration is usually done in time. How much will the impact be there? How long will the impact last? What role will the resources or impact have on the community or the environment? And then the likelihood of the measures that are probable impacts may occur. The unlikely to occur, possibly may occur, probably will occur, and broken down, so forth. In my notes here I'll read right from it, is given the nature of the project, some impacts may be more likely to occur while others may possibly occur and others unlikely to occur. The reviewing agency may decide that unlikely impacts may be large magnitude and a long duration, but are ultimately not significant because they are so unlikely to actually occur. But in other cases, an unlikely impact may carry such a high risk that the reviewing agency may decide it is very significant. So you have to pretty much weigh the two of those things against each other. How likely is it, but how large the magnitude if that impact were to come. Here we have an example of magnitude, duration, and likelihood showing two big box stores. And reviewing the context as they are proposed, the one on the left is a Target in Nicollet Mall in Minneapolis, and the one on the right is a Walmart. So the duration, we know this is going to be a long-term and unlikely irreversible. I mean, when's the last time we've seen a sprawl mart turn into a forest at some day later down the road? So we're looking at all the circumstances and the facts surrounding the actual project itself, and the amount that these two big box stores have an impact. See the differences between the urban setting, where the infrastructure already exists and parking exists, as opposed to the one on the right, which is probably through sprawl, big parking lot had to be added, more infrastructure, and the capacity of existing and non-existent development between the two. So you're weighing the two of those against each other as an example. So what the likelihood of the impacts that are going to occur. The one on the right, there's more impacts because of more impermeable surfaces that you're creating by making this huge acres of parking, whereas the inner city urban mall, which may have the same size store, is not doing the same kind of impact by adding that much more parking.
Okay, so you have analyzed the criteria that JD was just talking about for their magnitude, duration, and likelihood. And then this is where you decide, will the action have a potential significant adverse environmental impact? The answer is no, a negative declaration is issued, the process concludes. If it's yes, a positive declaration is issued. So that's your determination of significance. And again, we will talk about the EIS process shortly. Okay, so with the negative declaration, your analysis of adverse environmental impacts has found that no likely impacts have been identified, none identified are significant, or any identified as significant have been mitigated through the seeker process. So again, perhaps through concessions on the applicant's part, by way of you kind of negotiating them down. Okay. Your written determination must include the reasons behind your conclusion. So the reason for which you issued a negative declaration, or the reasons rather, should be outlined in some sort of paragraph or textual format and included on the EAF, on the environmental assessment form. And that kind of information could also be included within your minutes as well. If you have any other subsequent meetings or hearings requiring legal notices, you need to include 2 pieces of information: the classification of the action and the fact that a negative declaration was issued. Okay, you don't have to publish a legal notice simply for this purpose. It's only if you have a requirement by local or state law to do so for another reason, perhaps for your public hearing at your next meeting. So you just incorporate that into the text. So a conditioned negative declaration, otherwise known as a CND, can only be utilized when certain criteria exists. So it can only be for unlisted actions, not for type 1. It can only be utilized if a full EAF was required and if a coordinated review was completed. So here's another kind of reason for utilizing that coordinated review method as opposed to uncoordinated, because it could afford you the opportunity to issue a CND. So what this is it's a conditioned negative declaration. And the Department of Environmental Conservation doesn't really like these. When in my discussions with the seeker unit, they generally discourage it. In fact, they were even talking about taking it out of the regulations as part of their revision, upcoming revision. But as far as I understand, it's staying in there. This can be a good tool as a way to kind of sweeten the deal in the last minute. So if the applicant, if several impacts still exist, or let's just talk about one impact, let's say it's traffic, it still exists, when you're ready to make your determination of significance, you might be able to convince the applicant to correct, mitigate, lessen that impact in the 11th hour, and that would give you the opportunity to issue this conditioned negative declaration, which is really a negative declaration with conditions. All right, so the conditions would somehow mitigate or lessen that traffic impact that was an issue. However, there are a few other, there's a few additional requirements to that of a negative declaration that have to be followed through with. Let's see, you have to publish a notice in the Environmental Notice Bulletin and provide at least 30 days for public comment. So within this 30-day public comment period, people may submit written comments. You might want to hold an additional meeting within 30 days in which to hear public comment. And if during that 30-day period, you must rescind the CND and issue a positive declaration if a substantive, so that means significant and relevant, comments identify that the mitigation measure may not be accomplished. So what you thought could accomplish or or that mitigation measure that you thought could reduce that traffic impact or impacts, it turns out it can't really be done, okay? So this is just kind of a way to memorialize conditions. GD?
Okay, after the negative declaration is given, each agency then returns to the underlying process, back to the actions to before what triggered seeker. The planning board, zoning board of appeals goes back to the site plan, subdivision variance, special use permits as were delegated to them in the first place. The local legislative body then, of course, might have to adopt a revision to their zoning or their comprehensive plan or the funding of the bonding of that project. And the state or local agencies goes and looks at the permits, grants and loans and bonds for the construction and the regulations that may apply. So the negative declaration may be amended or even rescinded at any time prior to the final decision, whether or not if changes were proposed or new information has been discovered and needs to be reviewed, or changes in circumstances related to the project arise. But sometimes the new changes come about, but no significant adverse impacts are added at that time, so it wouldn't change things at all. But if it significantly changes things, then you have to go back and review the process throughout the process of those new possible impacts. And then Aaron mentioned this earlier that when it's an uncoordinated review, when there's a positive declaration on an uncoordinated review, now it's being forced to go back to become a coordinated review, and then the EIS has to be processed. Excuse me. So with the positive declaration, it's intended for the lead agency to hold that low threshold, to look for the most minute thing that will have an impact on this. So we're going to look at this with a fine-tooth comb type thing. So that's why they're looking at it with that low threshold, rather than just generalize this may have an impact or whatever. The action has potential cause to result in at least one of the significant adverse environmental impacts that were listed before, and through the statement of the duration, the magnitude, and the timeline and the significance is all coming together. If no coordination of one agency's positive declaration supersedes another's negative declaration. So if it was uncoordinated and you had 4 agencies all doing this at once, and just one of them comes up with a positive declaration, then it supersedes the other 3 negative ones, and then you start the process, as Aaron said, all over again. To evaluate the possible impacts, you have to confirm that the significance is recorded on page 1, and then the agency, pretty much the lead agency, will do the positive declaration from there. And I was just going to be redundant here again, and then it has to go to a coordinated review if one finds it to be positive.
Okay, so now we're going to briefly talk about the EIS, or Environmental Impact Statement. And this document is meant to be a disclosure document. The process by which provides a means for agencies, project sponsors, and the public to systematically consider significant adverse environmental impacts, alternatives, and mitigation. So it facilitates the weighing, kind of provides for a balancing act between the different, all the different environmental sources and characteristics that you're trying to protect. But really we're looking at, we want to target the impact or impacts by which caused for a positive declaration in the first place. Okay, so you don't want to just look at, everything in the kitchen sink. You issued a positive declaration, for example, for traffic impacts. That's all you want to delve into within the EIS. You don't want to go back to square one and talk about everything else, all right? Now, there's other EISs, there's a supplemental EIS, there's a generic EIS. A generic EIS is meant for actions that are more broad than a site-specific action. So this wouldn't apply to a subdivision application. All right, this applies to state agencies making laws that are applicable statewide. For example, when the analysis of hydraulic fracturing came about, the DEC used a generic environmental impact statement to study this because they weren't just looking at one municipality or one county, they were looking at the state. All right, so they were looking at a much broader review. This could also apply to, for example, a comprehensive plan. A lot of consultants will advise municipalities to go forth with a generic environmental impact statement when they are adopting a new comprehensive plan or new zoning. So that would analyze, for example, the zoning revision would analyze the municipality at full zoning build out under the proposed zoning revisions, all right? So this would provide the community more information as to what would be expected if the zoning revisions pass as is, okay? So generic EISs don't generally apply to land use review boards. All right, is this you or I, JD? I'm not on to the next page yet. That's you.
Just keeping up with you. Okay, so in preparation of the EIS, or the draft EIS, it pretty much is prepared or close to be prepared by the lead agency. And ultimately the document belongs to the lead agency. If unacceptable, you have to give guidance along the ways to make sure that it adheres to the time frame, so we're getting it done in time. The obligations to have the sponsor really has that clock ticking that they want their project to be approved, and it only affects them in the long run if you delay this. And so you want it to be precise and everybody's on the same page with this. So when it's prepared by the sponsor and submitted to the lead agency pretty much has to determine, is it adequate? If what they gave me, what the sponsor gave us is adequate to go on to be for standard and public review afterwards. It may be returned to the sponsor by the lead agency for revisions. And if that's done, you must provide specific written comments and suggestions of what are the changes. Why wasn't it adequate enough? Why are you asking for the resubmission? And so the lead agency has 45 days to do that initial review, or 30 days to review it after it's been resubmitted. And when circulated to the involved agencies, it needs a cover page with all the contact and dates and everything right there, published right onto that cover page. And then we're getting ready for the minimum of the 30-day public comment period after the filing of the notice of the completion of the EIS and the draft of the EIS. The initial statement is prepared by either the project sponsor or by the lead agency. And that's all part, and it's spelled out by Part 6, 17.9 of the preparation of it. And then, of course, then there is, you can charge a fee for either doing the review or preparing the review, but you can't do it for both. Okay. Scoping. The whole idea of the scoping is to narrow it down to the issues to ensure that the EIS will be concise and accurate and, as I said earlier, adequate for the public review. The sponsoring and scoping of this is to ensure that the public participation of the EIS, that they have a chance to have comment on it, to allow open discussion of the issues and public concern, to permit inclusion of relevant substantive public issues and file a written scope. That means some other findings, we had talked about earlier, some interested parties might want to add that this has been overlooked in your EIS and should be included in it. And the scoping process also helps the lead agency and the other agencies pretty much come to the conclusion of whether or not this draft is ready to go forward. Then there's the scoping may be initiated by the applicant, but the sponsor or required by the lead agency. And the scoping may be formal or informal. And for my notes here, let me just describe the two. Formal is initiated by the lead agency or requested by the project sponsor. It results in a written scope of the issue that is controlled and the responsibility of the lead agency. The purpose is to narrow the issue and ensure the draft EIS will be adequate for the public review and ensure the public participation of the EIS development process. Now for informal, the draft EIS is based on informal comments from the involved agencies and the positive debt. This is fine for small, already defined actions with relatively a narrow range of clear impacts that have been identified. In general, though, the EIS is without scope often attempt to discuss every topic conceivable. So when it's informal, it's just too much to be included in there. The lead agency also risks not discovering issues or resources of local importance or overlooking resources or sources of information on a local site and its history. So preferably there'd be the formal of the two. You.
And just one note on scoping. Currently it's optional, but under the proposed changes to the regulations, it's going to be mandatory. And I know I've mentioned this a couple times that there are some proposed changes. It's not going to procedurally change the process. So most of everything what you've heard today will still apply. A lot of it pertains to, with the exception of scoping being mandatory, a lot of the changes pertain to items on the lists. So some new type 2 actions are going to be added to the type 2 list, which is exciting, like solar is going to be added there. And there's going to be some tweaks to the type 1 list as well. And we've included in your packet, it's the scoping document for the proposed changes. It's only the first and second page of that document, so it's going to be in the back of your packet somewhere. And you can find this online, or you can ask us for a copy. We can send you the link or the PDF. So we've only given you the first and second page of that, but it just shows you generally what some of the proposed changes are. Okay, so drafting the EIS. Okay, so you want to describe the action, the location and setting. So you want to expand upon what's found in the EAF, and this is, all going to be in narrative form rather than, kind of bulleted form as is so for the EAF. You're going to evaluate the potential significant adverse impact or impact that gave you reason to issue a positive declaration. And you're going to identify potential mitigation measures, mitigation meaning reduction, so ways to reduce that impact, discuss reasonable alternatives to the proposed action, and lastly, analyze the no action alternative. This is I always thought this was weird to me, the no action alternative. You'd say, well, of course there's going to be less impacts if the action doesn't happen. But you might want to think about some sort of commercial use, such as an industrial park or tech park, something like that. That might bring a lot of jobs into your region or community, right? Jobs that you wouldn't get if the action were not to happen or exist. Okay, and remember, economic impacts are included under the umbrella of seeker, of environmental impacts under seeker. Okay, public hearings are probably the most common reason for which municipalities get in trouble in court under seeker, because there's this annoying kind of piece here, this annoying distinction that people don't either agree with or realize. First of all, seeker hearings are optional. Furthermore, if you have a seeker hearing, the purpose is to have a hearing on the draft EIS. All right, so you've completed that draft EIS, you're bringing it forward for the public to take a look at, the public to comment on. You're not asking the public for comment about whether a positive or negative declaration should be issued. The only reason for a seeker hearing should be based upon what information is included within the draft EIS. And even still, as I said, it's optional. Okay. Many communities like to have public hearings earlier in the process. They want to front load their public hearing because they want help making their decision about whether they're going to issue a positive or negative declaration. And this is okay only if you state for the record and make it known that this is not your seeker hearing, it's not your official optional seeker hearing, or hearing required by state law for subdivisions or local law for site plans or anything like that. It's an optional public hearing that you're doing, front loading towards the beginning of the process to receive public input. So I would suggest that the municipality, if they're going to do this, they take the onus of the financial cost for publishing that notice upon themselves and not burden the applicant with that. And make sure that it's in the minutes, that it's put out there and it's stated, because like I said, this is the most common reason for procedural litigation when I say seeker, is the point at which the hearing is done. Municipalities are always getting this mixed up. All right, so anyway, back to the optional seeker hearing. This should be one in the same with any hearings required of you by state law or local law. So again, hearings required of you under town law for subdivision review or for use variances, or your local law for a site plan approval. So they're held as one and the same. You need to extend your noticing period 14 days rather than that 5-day period that it normally is. And the hearing must start between 15 and 60 days after the notice of completion with hearing is published in the environmental notice bulletin. There's a slide on that at the end. So it's kind of this additional thing that has to be taken care of. So make sure your board secretary or chairperson is on top of this. And the public comment period continues for at least 10 days after the close of the hearing. And you might find that this 10-day period could be good for you because after the public hearing, those in the audience might be inspired to maybe further investigate the project after they've kind of heard what's going on, and they might come back and they might provide you with some more information during this period. JD, I believe it's you.
Yeah. For the project where the lead agency is reviewing the application and not funding the project, the FEIS should be completed within 45 days after the public hearing, or within 60 days after the DEIS or the notice of completion, if no hearing is required. So then, as the case of the DEIS, once the FEIS is completed, a notice of completion must be prepared, and that's done by the lead agency. Acceptance of the FEIS is the issuance of the finding statement. No involved agencies can issue a finding or final decision until a reasonable time period, not less than 10 calendar days, have passed since then. And then for public consideration, the period is not the same public as for public comment period for the DEIS. It is not a review of the period of additional comment per se, but it should be a project notification of the circumstances required by the lead agency. Involved agencies substantially modify its decision if you modified the decision, and it's usually it's all accomplished, and the preparation of supplemental DEIS is recommended if changes are are significant. So if there are changes, then you must make those changes and then supplemental to the DEIS of any of those changes. The content revised of the EIS, the final EIS contains the original draft environmental impact statement and any of the revisions that were made along the way. The final EIS is the lead agency's product and is responsible for its accuracy and for it being adequate. And then any kind of general objections to the project need no response at this time. But the lead agency decides which comments of the draft EIS must be responded to in the final EIS. And then substantive comments related to the relevancy to impacts and mitigation and alternatives all must be included in the FEIS. Good part here is the part 617.3, which has the conditions where the lead agency has the authority to impose substantive conditions that are practical and reasonably related to the impacts identified in the initial environmental impact statement. So these would be pretty much conditions that would mitigate some of the problems that you uncovered. There was another point I wanted to make on this slide, but it was, no, I guess not. I had two other things I highlighted. Okay, decisions. The findings must be, consider all the information in the FEIS. It's the environmental factors are all put into balance. The economic values, the environmental, all those impacts are balanced out. Provide the rationale for your decisions. You just pretty much why you made the decisions you did when you're making the final. Clarify the rules have been followed, specifying that you have followed all the procedures of seeker. Certify chosen alternative mitigation adverse environmental impacts to the extent possible, and that's where you also include maybe the conditions that were set. And then the findings and the final decisions may be made concurrently, and then we'll put this all on the seeker form.
Okay, so the filing and publication requirements speak to that literal compliance that we spoke about earlier. All right, so here we are at filing, which simply means providing a copy to an individual. So what gets filed? For a type 1 action, both the negative and positive declarations get filed, which are now included within the EAFs. All right, it used to be kind of a separate form, and now it's included within the EAF, so that your determination of significance is going to be there. So you provide a copy of that to involved agencies, so other agencies that perhaps didn't participate in a coordinated review, the applicant, any individuals upon request, and your CEO, which is generally going to be your mayor or town board. This also applies for CNDs and positive declarations for unlisted actions. It also applies to EISs, so that EIS, that final document, gets supplied to or provided to involved agencies, applicant, and so forth. And the same holds true going down the line. All these items get filed with those individuals. And there might be some additional filing requirements. If a positive declaration was issued, only the EIS, a copy of that goes to the DEC. All these other findings doesn't necessarily go there, okay? Just a copy of the EIS. And if a positive declaration was issued and it was pertaining to land in a coastal area, that EIS or copy of AEIS goes to our agency. It goes to, you can address it to the Secretary of State, and that would fulfill that requirement. So the ENB, or Environmental Notice Bulletin, is this online publication. It's the official online publication of the Department of Environmental Conservation, and it's a way to record everything that's going on with seeker actions across the state. And so we have the website here, and this applies to, again, negative and positive declarations for type 1s, CNDs and positive declarations for unlisted. Notice negative declaration for unlisted is not here. Notice of completion of an EIS, all of those things get published on the ENB, and information for doing so is included on the remainder of the slide. And we'll wrap up right here unless anybody has any questions. Yep.
The list that you pointed out in your document for pending changes to the law?
Yes, the scoping document.
Right, so
Yes.
that's dated November 2012. When does this go into effect?
It's been on the legislative side for a couple of years. We do not know. We do not know when it will go into effect.
So it's sitting in committee, or you don't know anything?
I'm not allowed to say truly where it is. If you ask me off camera, I will tell you.
Okay,
But,
great, see you after.
yeah, so it's kind of been sitting out there for a while, and I don't know, we don't have a date, but I believe that many of the changes are positive, so we would like to see this accomplished. Any other comments or questions yet?
The timeframes on the environmental impact statements of, 45 days for notification and for acceptance and everything else like that. Been my experience that oftentimes it goes on and on, many, many meetings and many, many months. Can you talk a little bit about, how those timeframes are enforced and how, as a board member, you're able to spread them out so the board has an opportunity to further review them or have paid consultants further review them and give us back reports?
Extending those timelines is certainly okay if you have consent from the applicant. And as long as you have a good working relationship with them, they'll generally be okay with that. The enforcement mechanism goes back to the court system. If an applicant feels like a municipality is dragging their feet, or if they haven't met one of the timelines, they could file an Article 78.
So essentially, as long as you have a good rapport with the applicant, the time you have all the time you need to review it. But if what you're saying is that if the relationship with the applicant becomes
Strange.
contentious or strained, the applicant
They can
really
hold
has
you
the ball is in his court to push the board to make to move along quicker.
By way of Article 78 only. They can't go to the town board and, strong
just
arm
the
them
board.
into making you move faster. They can't go to our agency, they can't go to the DEC. It's all done through the court system. Any other questions? All right, I think you all have deserved some cookies, so let's dig into that, and we will reconvene in 15 minutes, so 7:20.
Welcome back from your cookie break. Everybody's here for local regulation enactment procedures, and this one's an hour and a half. And it's not as dry, I don't think, as the seeker. Yeah. Really? All right. All right, so to begin with, since colonial times, citizens of New York State have pretty much looked towards local governments for their basic services. And even today, citizens continue to look for their counties and their cities, their towns, their villages, for a great many of their needs. And when I say since colonial times, since we were free from those people from across the pond who speak a different language somewhat. But when you talk about your needs, you know, just as an illustrative point, maybe this will make it a little bit lighter for you. When you talk about the needs, when you talk about needs back to the colonial times even, looking towards your towns and your cities to come up with that kind of help. I pulled this one out as just as an illustrative point. A 1,000-pound horse will provide 30 to 50 pounds of manure a day, or 8.5 tons of manure a year. Back in 1752, Boston was so worried about smallpox and they thought it was coming from all the manure that they actually passed a law to have a tax to clean up the manure. And then by 1795, they were worried about yellow fever and they passed one to double the tax to clean up the manure. By 1908, there was 120,000 horses in New York City alone. So think about each horse doing 8.5 tons of manure. So when you talk about your needs, right? Simplest needs, you may not have even thought about that, you know, before cars, but it's like, who's gonna clean this up? And where are we gonna get the money for that? So that's just my way of making an illustrative point. The enactment of Article 9 of the state constitution and municipal home rule, which we are, a home rule state, and local governments have provided local governments with the means to be able to meet the challenges of our times. And through the adoption of local laws, the cities, towns, and counties have pretty much been able to pass their own laws without the state interfering. And that is all due to the MHRL, or Municipal Home Rule Law. And just as we close the other presentation, I mentioned there's a order form back there of some of the 35 different publications that we have on file, and some people have filled it out, and I'll mail you these publications. But this particular presentation, there's one that we have called Adopting Local Laws in New York State, and a lot of the information that I'm going to provide today is found in that publication. So anyway, Constitution home rule of power is now granted to all counties outside the New York City and all cities, towns, and villages. And prior to 1963, no towns and only a few villages had constitutional home rule power. So the Article 9, Section 2 states, controlling the allocation of power between the state legislature and local governments where the state legislature is specifically prohibited from acting with respect to the property, affairs, or government of any local government except for by general law or special law enacted at the request of 2/3 of a local legislative body. It's pretty much saying, you know, hands off. You have home rule law, you're responsible for your local laws. So local law is the broadest and the most superior form of municipal legislation. And as you see on this chart, it goes from the strongest to the weakest, with ordinances are limited to areas of regulation, and then resolutions have less or are weaker of an enactment. Thank you. All right, so the courts have pretty much recognized the difference between local laws and ordinances and resolutions, and similar for your legislative body and what powers that they have and what substance they go along with. The other publication that both Aaron and I mentioned was the Guide to Planning and Zoning in New York State, that 198-page publication. And so when we make reference to different town law, city law, village law, they're all pretty much written the same way. They just change whether it's a village or a town or whatever. But under the doctrine of legislative equivalency, the local legislation can only be amended by the same procedures as it was enacted. So that neither an ordinance or a local law can be amended by a resolution. So what that is saying, that it's only the same kind of powers that could amend that same kind of power or that kind of legislation. So what is an enactment? Well, your local laws, ordinances, and resolutions enact. basically, that's what it says. The name says it all. By enacting, it's establishing a legal or authorized act, somehow or another, to make into law. In contrast, it's the rules, regulations, bylaws, codes, plans, or even general procedures are not enactments. And a motion is a tool in which the enactment is actually introduced, but it's not an enactment itself. So then we'll talk about police power to regulate persons' property for the purpose of securing public health, safety, and welfare. And when we have these are case laws that they are making reference to, where a lot of our laws come from, or that the, I just lost the word that I was going to use, but anyway, where we use as a standard now when we go back to case law. So the police power defined as the power to regulate persons and property for the purpose of securing the public health, safety, and welfare, comfort, peace, and prosperity of the municipality and its inhabitants. So it's implied to grant and to govern. Within the precise limits, it has included the precision of laws for the prevention, suppression, abatement of public nuisances, including street nuisances, air pollution, preservation of public peace and tranquility, regulation of hours of business, protection of public against offenses in violation of the public morality and decency, regulation to public amusements, recreation, and resorts, protection of public health in connection with regulation of sanitation, as was my first point I made, and with regulation of disposal of waste products, interments, cemeteries, keeping of animals, protection of the public from the negative effects of industrial and commercial developments, fraudulent sales, weights and measures, and proper growth of municipality through zoning. So all those things come under the umbrella of police power. Local laws and ordinances are enacted and they are very rarely struck down by the courts on the grounds of the subject matter that are not within the scope of the municipal police power. And the last part of the last point on this slide is pretty much, it's a test of validity. A problem exists, as I talked about, the illustrated point I made in the opening, all the manure, the means selected to cure the problem, and the substantial relation to the result that is sought, and the means available that do not infringe upon other people's rights. So those are the three things. There's the problem, then we have the solution, and how do we apply the solution without it infringing upon fundamental rights.
Okay, so a local law may be viewed as a form of municipal legislation. And I'm sorry if I'm repeating something that JD said, but the local law is the strongest of all the forms of enactments. And there's something known as the doctrine of legislative equivalency, which means if you would like to revise any local law, you may do so by local law. If you would like to repeal an ordinance and replace it with another form of enactment, you may do so by ordinance or local law. Now, you may not repeal a local law and replace it with an ordinance, okay? Because the local law is the highest. And the local law has the same, as JD said, has the same constitutional strength as an act of the legislature. And it was found by this court case, matter of Mooney and Cohen, that it's just as binding. So that's pretty big. That means your local laws are just as strong as anything that the Assembly, Senate, and Governor approves, okay? And local laws can relate to property, affairs, or government. And while this power comes to you from the Constitution, the procedures are outlined within Municipal Home Rule Law, section 10. So in other words, Municipal Home Rule Law carries out the power that is ordained to local governments within the New York State Constitution, Article 9. And there are some other sources of authority as you go through the enabling statutes, as you look through the one that pertains to you, so general city law, town law, village law, you will notice areas within these that pertain to rights given to you to adopt local laws for certain subjects, such as zoning. You are given that opportunity to adopt zoning by local law, and in fact, that's actually best practice because zoning really is so important within a community, and there can be a lot of litigation behind it, so we certainly suggest that you use the strongest form of enactment there. There's some advantages to using the local law. It has the same strength as a state special law. So, a general law is defined as a state statute which in terms and effect applies alike to all counties, cities, towns, and villages. So it uniformly applies to all of the same jurisdiction type. All right, so in other words, town law, that would be a general law, usually. All right, most of which is found in town law would be considered a general law. There's going to be some exceptions and limitations because it's meant to generally apply generally to all. Did I say general city law or towns? To all towns alike. Now a special law. Okay, so this is to be contrasted with a special law, which is a state statute, so a state law. That in terms and effect applies to one or more, but not all counties, cities, towns, or villages. All right, so there's a distinction there. And let's see, I have an example over here. Or rather, it can be difficult to determine on its face if a state law is, or rather on its face, a state general law. A state law may appear to be general, however, an exception may exist. For example, under Town Law Section 23 and Public Officers Law Section 3, both require town officers in general to reside within the town. However, there's been an amendment along the way, or an exemption rather, they're one and the same here, that allows for the town of Newcastle town highway superintendent to be allowed to reside outside of the town's jurisdiction. All right, so there are some exceptions to different jurisdictions along the way. You know, you might not be aware of any that might actually apply to you, so I suggest that you speak with your municipal attorney about this. Okay. So anyway, since your local law is not going to apply uniformly to all your local law for, say, you as a town, it's not going to apply to all towns across New York State, it would be considered to have the same strength as a special law because it only applies to you. Local laws can be enacted relatively quickly and conveniently, and they have the advantage of having a broad effective date. So you could make the law effective immediately, or you could make it effective upon filing with the Secretary of State, which is within our agency, the Department of State. And it should be noted that the operative date could be different than the effective date. Usually municipalities keep them to be one and the same, but technically, a local law could be operative before or after an effective date. An example would be adopting a local law regarding junk, maybe junk cars on the front of your property. Perhaps that local law was put into place because there happens to be an offender in your community. That local law being adopted, that operative date could while it might not have reached the desk of the Secretary of State, or rather the people under the SOS, you can make that law operative immediately, and upon serving that individual with the law, they will be forced to clean up that mess. And the same thing could hold true on the other side. Let's say a certain administration adopted a law in October, but they knew they were turning over the new fiscal year, and they could make it operative as of January 1st. So let's see here. Also, generally, I know we're using this word a lot here, generally you may supersede the enabling statute that applies to your municipality type. So an example, a really simple example could be a supersession of the state training requirement. So the state training requirement says all planning and zoning board members must receive 4 hours or at least 4 hours of training per year, and the consequence is that you are not reappointed when your term ends. Your town could supersede state law and change either the number of hours required, you could increase it or decrease it, and perhaps you could say that the consequence is at the end of a calendar year or fiscal year, if a particular member hasn't achieved their full required number of hours, that they could be removed from the board. Okay, so these are really simple things, but this is actually supersession of a state law. And there are limitations. There's some areas in which you cannot meddle with at all. You cannot be inconsistent with the state constitution in any way, and there are a list of 10 enumerated subjects that it applies to, which are really, really long. Maybe I can, and it's in really tiny font here, maybe I can just name a couple of these. The transaction of state business. You can't meddle with that. The preservation, ascertainment, and discharge of claims against the state. Okay, so there's 8 other ones there, and you cannot touch those. And you can't have any inconsistencies with any general law. Now, here's an area where there's state preemption, which means that you may not supersede the state law. And that would be in the area, and specifically applies to you folks here, and that would be in the area of variance review. All right, so the state has put into place a 5-prong area variance test and 4-prong use variance test. This is applied statewide, no exceptions. All right, so you are not allowed to decide that you would like to cut out one of the prongs or add another prong to the test. You must stick to the state statute. Every municipality across the state is using the same 2 tests. And there's no supersession of matters of state concern. Okay. So whenever a local law is under consideration, your municipal attorney must reach a decision as to the existence and extent of local law power in relation to the subject matter at hand. So this entails in substance the resolution of 3 threshold questions as followed. I only see 2 here. Oh, I see what they've done here with the slide, excuse me. After having, sometimes we mess with each other's programs and move the bolts around on each other. After having resolved the issues, the municipal body can turn to the several steps involved in the development and adoption of the local law, which JD is going to talk about in just a couple slides. And there's certainly team effort involving many municipal players and perhaps members of the community that inspired the adoption or revision to a local law. So here we have these, or rather the municipality must, the municipal attorney must resolve these 3 questions here. Does the proposed subject matter of the local law fall within the general or specific grants of power contained in municipal home rule law or elsewhere? Are there any restrictions, limitations, or prohibitions which would work against the exercise of such power? And is there overriding general law on the subject, or has the state preempted the field? So this is all kind of background work that your municipal attorney needs to do. This is not something that should be put in any of your hands. So every local law has 4 parts, beginning with the title, and the title should be very concise. I know it's tempting to kind of go on with, sort of a paragraph here. We'd like to, adopt this junkyard regulation because we see a lot of cars and tires in people's front yards, and we want to make sure that you got to try to keep it very concise. And the body of the law can contain all of that stuff, justification and all of that. The second part is the enacting clause. So this is the authorization for you to do so. Okay, so be it enacted by the Board of Supervisors of the County of Saratoga as follows. So you are identifying yourself, be it the town board, city council, or village board of trustees, or county legislative body, county board of supervisors. You are identifying yourself as having the authority to do so. The body of every, hang on here, I have one more note on that. Okay, so this quoted wording must appear in every local law. So this isn't just a formality, it has to happen. A failure to include an enacting clause renders a local law invalid. All right, so the body of every proposed local law consists of 1 or more parts referred to as sections, which should be consecutively numbered with Arabic numbers 1, 2, 3, etc. And there are various types of sections, legislative declarations, separability clauses, also sometimes known as severability clauses, which basically means that if any one part of the local law is found to be invalid by the court, that the rest of the law holds valid. All right, without that piece, if one part of the law was found to be invalid by the court, then the whole thing could be thrown out. And you might have some really good stuff in there. You might have had just kind of one error. So separability, or otherwise known as severability, severs any sections which could be found in the future to be invalid. Some other things could be effective dates, appropriations. A failure to specify the chapter, number, year, or act of the statute does not affect the validity of the law. And as I mentioned in a previous slide, the effective date, generally this local law shall take effect immediately. That's generally commonplace. And again, effective date, not operative date, could vary. If you're going to do that, make sure you list it somewhere in the law.
Erin had given you some examples of how you can supersede the state law. One that may apply to you, it's right in the state statutes in town law, village law, city law, for you to be able to have alternatives on your planning boards and zoning boards for the sole purpose of conflict of interest. It's right there in the statute. They don't have one for having alternatives appointed to provide for absenteeism. The snowbirds, the people that go to Florida and then aren't there for the board, and you don't have enough members to make a quorum, you would have to supersede state law by enacting a local law saying that we are going to have alternatives to provide for absences, sicknesses, so forth. That's one example. So, and on this slide, Erin has already made an adoption. We could adopt some more things on our slideshow here too. How a proposed law is adopted. It says here to present the draft. So here's the draft law. You see a problem, it presents itself. Erin had used like a junkyard type thing as an example. The second part to that would be then to have seeker look at the draft of the law that it was presented. Is it going to have any environmental impacts or what's up? Then the hearing notice has to go out, and we're going to talk about that. If there's any changes, then you have to go back to redraft it, go back to the present draft to present the draft, and then go down the public hearing, go for a vote, and then record the law. And then, of course, then you'd have a resolution ready for the public hearing at the regular meeting of a town board, of the town of blank blank, county of whatever. And then you would have the 4 parts that Aaron had suggested are mentioned into it or entered into it to say what exactly it is and what the body of it is. Such as the example I have here is they were trying to do away with a lot of congregating of teenagers in the park after hours. And so how they were going about to have, whereas it be resolved that pursuant to Section 20 Municipal Home Law, Rule Law, it's proposed that local law 4 shall be on such and such day, talking about the prohibiting said congregation at the town park during certain hours for the protection and preservation of property of the town and all its inhabitants' peace and the order within, so and so forth. So you're presenting the draft. So only the governing board member can introduce the draft. It comes down as a part of the time frame is responsibility of the municipal attorney to see that the format and the procedures are adhered to, that you put it together. The local governing board has heard a citizen's complaint, has received information regarding a problem within the municipality. The complaint or the problem has created a need for a local law. So then the municipal attorney is requested to draft a law which deals with the problem at hand. How are we going to deal with this? So the law is presented to the municipal governing board and introduced by one of its members. And how that is done is presented at a meeting, or draft, as they say, is placed on a desk or table. And then there's a 7 to 10 day introduction period. Otherwise, it can be mailed, the draft, and then the 7 to 10 days is pretty much calendar days. Then you don't count Sundays and so forth. And you don't count the day that it was received or the day of its passage. So it goes through that process there from step 1. Step 2 is pretty much the notice of the hearing is published, which informs the public, governed by the proposed law, that such a matter is before the municipal body, and this is what we're looking at to pass as a law. So it publishes a legal notice at least 5 days prior to the hearing, or shorter if your local law has that option, if it's a local law that says 3 days or whatever. And refer to the applicable statutes of doing the actual hearing notice in the newspaper and also previous to the hearing itself. But there's no state statutes or guidelines that say how extensive the notice should be. So pretty much be precise. Generally, the 5-day notice, unless the law prescribes a shorter period of time, is adequate enough. But then you put in the notice, briefly, we're going to be discussing the hearing is proposed law of the town set forth to hear about curfew on town park between these hours and that, and so forth. Just so the people know what to come out for, and they might want to add to the hearing itself and be heard.
Okay, is this me?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so the purpose of public hearings are, and this doesn't just apply to local laws, are to receive public comment. And the comments received are to help the reviewing body or board make a decision. So many or all of you here today are Planning and Zoning Board of Appeals members. I'm sure you conduct your own public hearings and consider what the public has to say about a particular application, right? So your governing body should be doing the same thing. If your governing body would like to adjourn, meaning perhaps you've had overwhelming public interest and there's just no way to get through hearing everybody speak, and you'd really like to afford them the opportunity to, the rest of the people to come forward and speak, your town board may adjourn the public hearing which is different than closing it. So adjourning it leaves the door open. If the town board adjourns to an unspecified time and place, then notice must be given in the same manner. So you have to go back to publishing the hearing notice again. However, if the town board announces when and where they're going to pick back up on that hearing, then you don't need to go ahead and publish that notice again. The Committee on Open Government, which is housed within our agency, has opined that 3 minutes is enough to hear public comment for a particular individual. Some communities might have the problem of having citizens come in and perhaps go speak at length and maybe not even being, not sticking to the substantive nature of the proposal at hand. They might get a little emotional and go on and on. You are afforded the opportunity to cut off public comment at 3 minutes. Just be consistent. Don't let, somebody go on for 10 minutes and then cut off another person earlier than that. Make sure that you are being consistent in applying that rule. Okay, so in terms of voting and adoption, if no changes are made to the proposed law, the governing board may move forward to adoption. And as JD was talking about, there is a 7-day wait, or rather, the waiting period depends on the method of delivery. So if we're using the method of placing the proposed draft on the table of the other board members, that period would be 7 days, okay? That basically means that you have handed them a copy of that law, and that, there's different ways, as JD talked about, there's different ways to introduce a law. If it's at a meeting, it's pretty obvious that that was the day that that proposed law was placed on a desk. So it's 7 days. You don't count the day that it was placed on the desk, and you don't include the day it's adopted, so those 2 days are taken out of the equation, and no Sundays. And no Sundays really comes into play when you use the method of mail delivery, because there's no mail on Sunday. You mail using United States Postal Service, nothing's happening on a Sunday. So, however, they have come to apply that to the 7-day on the desk method as well. Now, if there are changes made, then the municipal attorney needs to go back and revise the original draft, and the whole process starts all over again, okay? Which is fine. It's best that you have the best possible local law drafted as possible, yeah?
Eric, can you define what changes mean? What's change?
Well, you mean if typos are fixed, would that consider a change?
Or minor changes? Anything that does with the intent of?
Maybe the example of the park, and that the proposed law is that the park closes at 6 o'clock on weekdays and 8 o'clock on weekends. Then you are making the proposed changes that it should be 8 o'clock every day. That would be a change.
I wouldn't like to speculate on that. I don't know for sure, but generally when it comes to local government decisions, the legal term is substantial changes. And that term is very subjective, and it's usually, the review board is usually given deference as to what is substantial. That's generally how it works for like planning and zoning board members, okay? Items before you. So I hate to, I speculate that that would apply here. If you're really not sure, and you your municipal attorney isn't sure, or you disagree with them, you can always call our office. We offer free legal advice. JD and I are in the planner section of local government, but we also have a staff of attorneys available to local government officials such as yourself, and their phone number is listed just alongside our phone number on the last slide of each presentation. So you can, make the call directly to them, go right up the chain. Okay, so the next step, step 5, is recording the law. For it to become effective, the municipal clerk must file one certified copy in the clerk's office. Certified means signed and sealed, all right? So your municipality should have some sort of stamp with your seal on it that your municipal clerk would have control of. So this is going to be sealed. It's going to have signatures on it, and let's see, it's probably going to be your clerk's signature. This doesn't say here. I believe it's your clerk's signature, and probably your chief elected officer. So the CEO for cities and villages is the mayor. For towns, it's the town board, including the supervisor. However, it would generally be the supervisor that would take on that responsibility. And another copy, including the seal and signatures, must go to our office, our agency rather, must go to the Secretary of State within 20 days. Some common problems could be that the original was not sealed, so that stamp was missing, and or signatures were lacking. Oh, excuse me, it's the clerk's and attorney's signatures that are required. Sorry about that. So one of those signatures might be missing. You might have excluded the passage date, illegible text, that's probably least common, and lastly, the DOS or Department of State has its own official form that has to be used with the law. And if we're talking about a zoning law, make sure to include the new zoning map with the text portion of the zoning revision of the local law, okay?
Okay, can the public vote on a local law? And that just says here maybe. Well, maybe is depending on whether the local law requires a referendum or not. And a referendum, or to be permissive, and I have the definition between the two. If the local law is not subject to a referendum, it is ready for filing after it has finally been adopted. Final adoption occurs after it has been received the required public hearing and after it receives the majority affirmative vote of the total voting power of the legislative body. Okay, so the difference between a mandatory and a permissive referendum, a mandatory referendum is needed before the law can pass. The law should be drafted and the referendum occurs, the referendum passes, the law now can be passed. For a permissive law, the law is proposed, a hearing is held, the local government, the board takes a vote, but then must wait 45 days for the members of the public to file a petition before filing. What that 45 days is that the public might have something to say about whether they want that to just go ahead by the municipal body voting on it. They want a referendum where the public is able to vote upon it. So on this slide, for something mandatory, change the governing board membership or the composition of the membership, or abolish the elective office, or change the terms of office, or reduce salary of any elective office during that term. Those are kind of mandatory. Create a new elective office. If you never had a dog catcher before and you're going to have an elective dog catcher, well then that would have to be a mandatory referendum. Now for permissive, it goes with the public notice that they pretty much have voted on it. The governing board has voted on it, but they have to they have to wait 45 days to have it act upon it. Because that 45 days is when the public can go ahead and do a petition to say, no, we want this to come to a permissive referendum where we get to vote on it. And here's some of the examples here, such as condemnation power of eminent domain, or the change of provisions of law relating to public buildings or purchases or contracts, and the real property assessments, and authorized insurances of bonds and other obligations, and reappointments of people. So a general vote by the electorate on a single political question that has been referred to them, and a direct decision has been made, now has to wait 45 days to see if the public wants to do a petition and say, no, we want a permissive referendum. Okay, for the local law to be submitted to general election held not less than 60 days thereafter. So pretty much what it says then for that is that local law subject to mandatory referendum is provided in this section or in any other state statute shall be submitted for the approval of the electors at a general election of state or local government officers in such local government held not less than 60 days after the adoption, therefore, unless such local law provides for submission of approval from the electors at a special election, or unless within 30 days after the adoption of the local law, a petition signed, authenticated, and subject to certification by the clerk as provided for other petitions in section 24 of this chapter is filed with such clerk requesting submission of a special election. So what that is saying is so either they're going to come up with a, that it has to be on for a general election, but it has to be not less than 60 days before, or they can do the local law asking for a special election in 30 days. And that's part of Municipal Home Rule Law, Statute 23. Local law subject to mandatory referendum, if you want to make a reference to that. Spells that out. Now for permissive, remember I talked about the 45 days. It states, the local law adopted by county, city, or town and subject to referendum on petition as provided in this section or any other state statute is also subject to mandatory referendum, shall not take effect until at least 45 days after the adoption, nor until approved by an affirmative vote of the majority of the qualified electors of local government voting on the proposition for its approval, if within 45 days after its adoption, there be filed with the clerk a petition protesting against the local law, signed and authenticated as herein required by qualified electors, and this is where it gets into the nitty-gritty here, qualified electors of such local government registered to vote therein, at least preceding a general election in a number equal to at least 10% of the total number of votes cast for governor in the last gubernatorial election of such local government. What that is saying is not only does in the 45-day time limit, there has to be a petition, but it has to be signed by 10% of everyone who voted in 10% of the number of everyone who voted in a gubernatorial election previously. So whatever that number is, then you'd have to do the math of whatever that 10% is. And that 45 days allows it a cooling off period, or the citizens' time to say, wait a minute, wait. The town board voted on this, but I really think it should go to the people. All right? Back to the permissive referendum. Basically, towns and cities have, like Darren said, 20 days after the adoption goes into effect, if not subject to the referendum, is when it becomes in effect. And then also with the Secretary of State. For villages, the local law takes effect 30 days after adoption if no petition is filed. So there's different numbers for towns, cities, and villages. And then, of course, Municipal Law 24 statute is the 45 days, subject to a petition referendum.
Okay, and I just want to make one last note on local laws that pertains to counties, because I believe members of the county legislative board plan to watch the video of this later. There is a special publication requirement that pertains to them. They must publish local laws in their official newspapers as required by County Law, Section 214. So, ordinances. This is the second most powerful form of enactment. They are also considered local legislative acts, and however, there are limitations imposed upon them as well, specified by the state legislature. And there's some examples of areas which a municipality may adopt an ordinance to govern over. So we have some examples here: dumps, street use, amusements, loitering, licenses, zoning. Some communities refer to their zoning regulations as a zoning ordinance. It may in fact have been adopted by ordinance, or it could have been adopted by local law, and it's just kind of a colloquial term. Excuse me, that they've just used over time. So, it's important to note that villages have not been able to use the ordinance power since 1974. I do not have an answer as to why, but that upon recodification of village law, this option was taken away from them. So village zoning regulations would most certainly be zoning local laws. So again, there's some limitations placed upon localities as to the subject matter that they may regulate. And we look to town law for towns, town law section 130. It speaks to town ordinances. It says the town board, after a public hearing, may enact, amend, and repeal ordinances, rules, and regulations not inconsistent with law for the following purposes, in addition to such other purposes as may be contemplated by the provisions of this chapter or other laws. So I suggest you go to that section if you're from a town. And this limitation was a result of this case law in 1890, so we're talking about a very long time ago. The courts found within deliberating over this case that towns are only they're only afforded such powers as were expressly, meaning clearly and specifically, conferred by statute. So adoption begins with introduction, and for ordinances, we're looking at introduction at the meeting. So this is different than the option afforded to local laws where the drafts could be mailed to the members. All right, and typically a resolution, our last form of enactment, might be used to introduce such a draft ordinance. And the resolution should include the complete ordinance text. It should be, and it should be, or rather the resolution to adopt the ordinance should carry an affirmative vote of the majority of the board. Okay, so for a 5-member board, that's going to be 3 members voting in favor. For a 6-member board, it would be 4. You get the idea. And certainly that needs to be entered into the minutes. And I'm going to just make sure you don't cover this part, JD. There is a publication requirement for ordinances. I'm sorry if you do get to this. Okay, I'll let you talk about that. Moving on.
Okay, hearing notice, and we will also provide one of our trainings is hearings and meetings. But public officers law and open meetings law both require that the public notice of a hearing is put in a conspicuously posted in one or more designated public locations. In my town, it's a town hall, and it's also in the front display case of the public library. Municipal home law generally requires 5-day notice for hearings for the adoption of local laws. Adoption and of amendments of village zoning regulations or comprehensive plans require 10 days advance notice. So depending on what you're doing with your law, or if you're adopting a comprehensive plan or just a local law. Public hearing is required. Don't forget all the open meetings law requirements of section 100 and notice of the conspicuously posted notice of when you're meeting or when the hearings are going to be held. You publish the notice in an official newspaper. You want to keep a copy of that once it is published, or at least what you sent, because the law doesn't say it must be published, but it says that you should send it to one designated newspaper having general circulation. So your attempt was there. According to our head attorney, this was just changed after 1990s. In the recodification of only a summary was required. In the past, publishing the entire verbatim of the ordinance was required. Now it's just a summary as of since 1990. And he only just brought that to our attention recently. The notice of hearing, there is no guidelines set forth in the content of the notice itself or how extensive the public hearing should be, but sufficiently the hearing should provide a complete presentation of the arguments for and against the proposed law, and then the public has a chance at the hearing to make their comments and generate any kind of their writing or sending it in and to the legislative body to be possibly enacted into the proposed law. Hearing specifics would be to hold at a time and place specified, and make sure that when you publish that, it's held at that place. And the same thing goes with the American with Disabilities Act, that if it's something that is controversial, that you have that hearing in a large enough auditorium so that the public can be there. So it can't be like at a town hall, we only had I think the capacity was 80 people, but if it was something that was controversial, we had to use the high school auditorium. Clerk should read the hearing, notice of proof of the publication or the attempt that they tried to publicate it, okay? What they sent to the newspaper. Then at that time they can read the proposed ordinance verbatim, but it's not required anymore since 1990, as I just mentioned. So a summary of it. Then making copies available for the people of the public that show up at the hearing that might want to read it as verbatim, and also be prepared to discuss it. And then invite the public comment to propose the law or ordinance, as Aaron said, maybe a 3-minute time limit. And do this in an orderly fashion. Perhaps in my town they had, as you came in, if you wish to speak on something, you did a sign-in sheet, and in the order that people signed in, that's the order that you get called. But again, as Aaron said, be consistent. You can't have somebody pro-Wally World speak for 10 minutes and somebody against Wally World cut them off in 2. You have to give the same amount of time and being consistent. So anyone wishing to speak or comment should be allowed to speak then. And then maintain the record of comments that were received. After the hearing is closed, the governing board reviews the comments received, but the vote need not be taken at that particular time of the hearing. And the proposed ordinance, as I have here on the slide, can be tabled even indefinitely. But
don't you have some kind of discretion to stop people from talking if they go on or if they're ranting? I mean,
yeah, the chairman should say, or the you're sitting next to the chairman of arms there, but to say, okay, your 3 minutes are up. Thank you, Mr. Jones. You had your 3 minutes. Right. Next. Sergeant of arms, I guess it would be, but it's really hard. I mean, ethics and, civility, of people, we've had board meetings where people have been mad and thrown things and kicked out spindles and stair banisters and stuff like that. But it's like, if you're giving 3 minutes to the 20 people before you, Mr. Jones, they all had 3 minutes, you're on to 5, enough.
Well, if someone's speaking to the point and making good comments, and and if you've limited everybody to 3 minutes, but somebody else who has something intelligent to say needs 5, is there some reason why you shouldn't allow that?
Well,
And vice versa?
In all fairness, if I was only given 3 and you're given 5, there has been times where I've gotten up to the podium to speak, and then I've given my 3 minutes to the person before me to finish his point.
Yeah, but the chairman of the board should have some kind of discretion to decide.
Yeah,
You
you
know.
should have that time limit.
Yeah.
I know.
And you're only responsible for recording somebody's position on a matter, such as Mrs. Smith was against the proposal, or Mr. Smith was in favor of the proposal. Legally, that's all you are responsible for recording in the minutes. So
You said thank you.
consider that. I mean, you might want to let them know that, or they might just get more irate. You never know. You could institute a policy of not closing the hearing at the same meeting, so they have the opportunity of submitting written comments. And then they can rant all they want via paper.
That'd be fine.
I just had a question about the minutes. There's a legal format of what must be recorded and what does not need to be? Where is that, if I wanted to read about that? How would I find a copy of that?
That is in open meetings law. Yeah, that's in open meetings law. The contents of minutes.
Is that one of your publications?
I
We
can
do
send
have a
it to you.
publication on it, yes.
I'll come down right after.
Okay,
So that Committee on Open Government that I mentioned earlier, they are the gurus on FOIL, meaning the Freedom of Information Law, and Open Meetings Law. So they are the foremost experts on it. Of course, we know about it as well, but, so the publications are really put out by them. Still our agency.
tongue in cheek is his name is Bob Friedman, and so I call it the Friedman of Information Law, because he pretty much wrote the book on it. He's the guru, and he's right there in our building. But yeah, on our website, Your Right to Know, if you go down to one of the last publications, Your Right to Know, and then that has all the information on that. But I can send you meetings and hearings and what is required. You don't have to have a stenograph, at all your hearings and stuff like that. That would have been worth it. Okay, so if there's no other questions, we'll get to effective date, and we talked about the different dates, and Aaron had some, I had some. Generally, it becomes effective 10 days after publication. That's for an ordinance. Okay, that's different than from a local law or the referendums where it was 45 days. And then, or unless it says right in the law itself, if so stated, this local law shall be in effect immediately, or this law shall take effect on June 1st, 2016, or something like that, unless it's specified right in the law. So, so the ordinance shall take effect from the date of its service against a person, and this is one of the examples that Aaron had used about, like, if it was something, is the example here? Yeah, the example about a junkyard or ordinance, somebody is having a tire cemetery in their backyard, and you're serving them as well at the same time. So it's immediate effectiveness date. Sorry. Resolutions.
Okay, so our last form of enactments are the resolution. Excuse me here. And I have to correct myself, I misspoke earlier when I talked about the state training requirements and you superseding state statute to amend them by local law. I forgot that it specifically says in the enabling statutes that you can do that by resolution. So it doesn't normally say that for things such as this in there, but it specifically says by resolution you can amend it. So I'm sorry about that. Can be done, can be accomplished through resolution, which is the easiest form of all the enactments to achieve. And the purpose of the resolution is it's a means by which the governing body expresses or takes a particular action on kind of like day-to-day affairs. such as honoring residents. You might have some sort of annual community service award, all right? So bestowing that honor upon somebody might be done by resolution. Or you might want to dedicate a veterans memorial. That could be done by resolution. Paying bills, also resolution. Hiring appointments can be done that way, but not creating a job. Okay, so creating a position, that can't be accomplished by resolution. I think that can be done by ordinance, if I remember correctly. I don't think that
Creating a position is mandatory referendum.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
Sorry.
It was listed in mandatory.
Sorry. Okay, so can't be done by resolution, but you can hire an employee, so you can assign somebody a particular job that's already on the books by resolution. And a resolution is different than a motion. A motion is a tool by which laws, ordinances, and resolutions are introduced. So a chairperson might make a motion to introduce one of the 3 forms of enactment, and you might have a policy where a second is required, and then it comes to a vote. Okay, so actions requiring resolutions, we have some here. Designating depositories, such as choosing a financial institution that your municipality is going to bank with. That, for example, requires a resolution. Establishing salaries can be done that way. Approving employee bonds, transferring money from one budget account to another. So these are things that need to be action that needs to be taken in public, so your comptroller or controller can't do this behind the scenes on their own. It has to be done formally, but it certainly doesn't rise to the occasion of needing an ordinance or local law. And lastly, you need to record the resolution within the minutes, the reasons for such resolution, all the details in clear, easy to understand language, outline all the actions to be taken. This is true for taking action of any sort. You need to record how each member voted, and certainly a majority of the fully instituted board, an affirmative majority is required. And absent members may not vote by proxy, meaning somebody else can't stand in their stead and let the public and the board know how the person who's out of town wishes to vote. Okay, that's not possible, but it is possible to vote via teleconferencing. Open meetings law has made a provision for that. So someone can participate, they could be a snowbird, they could be in Florida, and they can participate in the meeting. However, the sticking point is that is now, wherever they are teleconferencing from, be it their hotel room or their home, is now an additional location for that public meeting. So the public is authorized to attend as well from that location. So notice needs to be posted for that location as well. So if it were done out of their home, they can let anybody in off the streets. Remember, public meetings, it's not just taxpayers in your community. It's anyone globally. They could just pop in. So if it's somebody, who's out of town, stayed at a hotel, maybe you might want to do it in the hotel lobby or some sort of conference room or something like that, not your own private quarters.
Has to be advertised, though.
Has to be advertised,
So.
correct. So, all right,
You
so,
had a question back there.
okay, sure.
If someone was gonna vote on a resolution via teleconference, do they need to maintain a connection to the teleconference for the entire meeting? Or can they just do it for the amount of time where a specific resolution is discussed?
I would suggest that they do. I'm not 100% sure, but I will say this. A quorum's needed to have the meeting in the first place, and if their attendance is a difference between not having a quorum and having a quorum, they better be in attendance the whole time. I'm not sure about just popping in for a particular issue. It doesn't seem like it's in the spirit of open meetings and transparency and all that good stuff, so I would say no. In the front.
You mentioned snowbirds twice during this conversation. Is there any residency requirements to positions on the boards?
Yeah,
Well, generally,
generally, yeah. Need to be a resident in the municipality on which you serve.
where there's a waiver for that is to be on village, to be a resident of the village if you're going to be on the town board.
Do you actually need a waiver?
Well,
But, because you're in the town.
Right,
If
right.
you're in the
So-
village, you're also in the town.
Right,
So you could be on both village boards and towns. I
but
don't
for
think
you to
there's-
be like on the planning board, you're,
Yeah, or the zoning board, I mean, some people go for 7, 8 months, they show up for, they can show up for the meetings, and then they're gone from October to June or May,
That's the kind of question for the Committee on Open Government. They get all of those really, they get any question you have, any question imaginable, it's been asked already. Yeah, I wonder if there's a certain percentage of the year that you have to maintain residency in the locality, maybe 6 months or more. I don't know the answer to that.
Where do you vote?
Where you vote, that might be the answer. Yeah.
Yeah, you should also tell people that in addition to voting yes and no, you can also abstain.
Yes, you can also abstain, that's true. And there's also the option of declaring a conflict
Or
of
not
interest.
voting at all.
Yeah,
I'd like to make a motion to disregard what he says.
yes, an
I second
abstention would be considered a non-vote. If you have a board of 3 and 2 members vote for and 2 members vote against, and then you've got somebody abstaining, that can make it tough, I suppose. When it comes to certain planning and zone, I'm not for these enactments, you need affirmative votes, so you need yes votes for them to pass.
Right.
For a subdivision, if you don't get affirmative votes for a subdivision within 62 calendar days of a public hearing, an automatic approval is given to the applicant. So there are some caveats, and in the case of zoning board of appeals, if a vote is not achieved, a vote either way is not achieved within that 62 calendar day period after the public hearing is closed, it's considered a default denial. So it affords the applicant the opportunity to sue the municipality through Article 78. Any more questions?
there's our general counsel's office, they're upstairs from us. So is codes, we don't have that number up there, but codes is just 1 floor above us. When we're not on the road, we do what we call tech requests. You call us and say, we're thinking of passing a local law on, pods or storage containers. What we'll do, what Aaron and I, our colleagues will do, is we can send you copies of other municipalities, how they worded their ordinance or their local law on subject matter. We can do that. But we're open to questions and anytime at our office. And we have the attorneys there to go to if you're gonna help us with a legalese question. Any other questions? Thanks for your attention, thanks for your comments and
Thank you.
questions. All right, get home safe.
Thanks for the kidney, Barb.
There's certificate of